The man known to history as James Longstreet was born on the 8th of January 1821 in the village of Edgefield, South Carolina. James's father, James Longstreet Sr., was of Dutch ancestry, his forefathers having settled in the colony of New Netherlands, which, in the late 17th century, became the English colony of New York. James was the fifth child of James and Mary Longstreet and their third son. Longstreet's story is entangled with the growth, development, and fracture of the United States in the second half of the 19th century. A Confederate general, Longstreet left a complicated record as a soldier, politician, and citizen that remains contested to this day. His family moved steadily southward, first to New Jersey, and then in the 1780s the family moved to Augusta, Georgia, some 700 miles distant. The move, facilitated by the end of the American Revolution in 1783, had re-established a tentative peace in the United States. Georgia, which had been largely occupied by British forces during the American Revolution, was one of the smallest states by population and offered a seemingly bright future for adventurous spirits, particularly those willing to invest in cotton production. Cotton, a plant fiber used in the creation of textiles, was gaining increasing popularity across the globe in part because of the increased production from plantations across the American South. Several years after the Longstreet family purchased their first plantation in Edgefield, South Carolina, some 28 miles north of Augusta, Georgia, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. This machine enabled the hardy short staple cotton to be processed into material fit for use in textile factories at a much quicker rate than any human could process it. This invention made cotton production possible in upland regions of the American South, such as the Piedmont region of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. When James Sr. was born, the explosion of cotton production was already sweeping the southern United States. Upon entering adulthood, James Sr. bought his own land near the Appalachian Mountains and grew cotton. Occasionally, James Sr. would come down to Augusta to visit the family. On one of these trips, he met his future wife, Mary Ann Dent. Mary Ann Dent's family was well connected, her father Thomas's cousin being the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who helped establish the independence of the judiciary and its prestige in American life over his tenure of 34 years. Mary Ann was a relative newcomer to Georgia. Originally from Maryland, her family had been long established there before her parents decided to seek their fortunes in the heart of Georgia. While it is unclear when exactly the two met, they were married by December of 1814. Following their marriage, Mary Ann moved with James Sr. to his plantation in the Appalachian foothills. There, she gave birth to 4 children: Anna, William, Sarah Jane, and John, though both Sarah Jane and John died as infants. In 1820, Mary gave birth to her 5th child in South Carolina, and the couple named their new son James, after his father. James grew up quickly in the Piedmont region, which was still heavily forested and wild. While slave labor had begun changing the landscape of northern Georgia, the region was still considered remote and dangerous. As a child, James hunted, fished, rode horses, and explored the woods. He spent his first 9 years with his family on the plantation before his father James Sr. felt it was time for his son to acquire a better education than what was offered in the backwoods of Georgia. In particular, James Sr. wanted his namesake to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point in New York. Young James was perfectly agreeable to these plans, and he spoke often with relatives about the glory of military service. In the autumn of 1830, as the summer harvest wound to a close, James Sr. and James Jr. travelled to Augusta to live with James Jr.'s aunt and uncle and attend the prestigious Richmond County Academy. Now James Jr. was to be taught by his uncle Augustus and Aunt Frances. Augustus, a well-connected and politically active man, helped instill in young James a passion for states' rights, or the concept that the states of the United States had not conceded their rights when they joined in a union in the 1780s. Thus, when in 1832 and 1833 the nullification crisis gripped the nation, Augustus was one of the leading voices supporting secession. The nullification crisis was a conflict over the ability of South Carolina to annul or ignore a national tariff law which they believed they shouldn't have to pay. Led by John C. Calhoun, one of South Carolina's brightest political stars and a firm believer in states' rights, the dispute nearly devolved into armed conflict and civil war. When the crisis passed, many of the ideas about states' rights had been embedded in the 12-year-old James as he listened to his uncle and his friends discuss the issue. While Augusta, Georgia paled in comparison to other American cities, it was a growing metropolis and one in which its citizens sought to be more connected to the outside world. James struggled in school, preferring the outdoors to the confines of the classroom. Still, the years of education helped him and gave him the network necessary to access West Point. James's world was rocked when, while on a trip in Augusta, James Sr. died during a local cholera outbreak. His mother soon afterwards moved the family to northern Alabama, thus creating both physical and emotional distance from her son, who remained in Georgia. As James mourned the loss of his father and his mother's move, he grew closer to his uncle and aunt. In some ways, they became surrogate parents for the young man looking to go far beyond the plantations of the South. Over the next 5 years, James continued to go to school and church, building relationships and helping on the plantation. In 1837, Augustus began working his connections to get an appointment for his now 16-year-old nephew to West Point. In order to enter West Point, the United States Military Academy, one had to have a nomination from a congressional official. Using his connections with a relative, Reuben Chapman, a congressman in northern Alabama, where James's mother lived, James was finally able to achieve his father's dream of becoming a military officer. He left for West Point in June of 1838. Arriving at West Point as a member of the class of 1842, Longstreet had little idea of how influential his years in the military academy would be on the rest of his life. James arrived at a time when the Academy was becoming far more robust and prestigious than it had ever been in its history. Founded during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson in 1802, West Point had already trained dozens of officers to lead the fledgling United States military. These officers, instructed in warfare and engineering, helped advance the military and imperial visions of the young American Republic. West Point engineers helped to design roads, canals, and military installations across the United States, helping solidify the American government's control on its vast expanse of territory and allowing greater expansion of settlers across the continent. Wars and treaties had decimated Native American power in the Midwest and Southeast, leading to a rapid expansion of American power. 8 years prior to James's arrival in West Point, and only several hundred miles to the northwest, the Cherokee people, along with other southeastern tribes, had been forcibly removed from their lands and transported to Indian Territory in what is now modern-day Oklahoma, in a removal that has become known as the Trail of Tears. This new territory, conquered by the United States, opened up vast swathes of land to farming and cotton planting, further necessitating more infrastructure, and gave even more opportunities to those schooled in engineering at West Point. James was never the best student, often struggling to not only pass his more academic classes of philosophy and foreign language, but to conform to a military lifestyle. James was stubborn and frequently found himself in trouble with the administration for his decisions to disobey Academy rules. During his time at West Point, he was nearly always in the bottom of his class. Yet, despite doing poorly on tests, he was retaining information that would be pivotal for his work as a military commander in the future. Longstreet was one of the most popular in the class and had the nickname Old Pete. He became friends with numerous future Union and Confederate leaders, but his closest friend was Ulysses S. Grant, a serious and quiet Ohioan who had doubted whether he should join the Academy. For the rest of their lives, the two men remained friends. On the 1st of July, 1842, James graduated from the Academy and was made a second lieutenant of the infantry. Assigned to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, with the 4th Infantry, James spent some time in Georgia before heading on his adventure. Stationed just south of St. Louis, Missouri, Longstreet was quickly instructed in the ways of the professional army. Located on the Mississippi River, much of his next 2 years was monotonous. However, with the arrival of his friend Ulysses Grant, he began to travel to the small town of Whitehaven. There, his best friend fell in love with 17-year-old Julia Dent. Only a few months later, James met Maria Garland. Maria, or Louise as she was called by her family, was the daughter of a prominent family of Virginian immigrants. Her father, John, a military man, was stationed at Jefferson Barracks. 17 and considered extremely pretty by the men at Jefferson Barracks, Louise soon fell for James. Though wanting to marry, they instead began a long engagement, as her parents insisted that the couple wait until Louise was older. A few months later, James was sent to Louisiana, hundreds of miles to the south, as part of the Army of Observation under the command of Major General Zachary Taylor. Tensions between the United States and the Mexican Republic were at an all-time high following the annexation of Texas in December of 1845. Texas, a former province of Mexico, had been opened up to American settlement in the early 1820s, in part to help provide greater strength to the poorly populated province. However, the arrival of white Americans from the South, who refused to comply with Mexico's prohibition on slavery and who began pushing for separatism, led to increased tensions with the Mexican central government. In 1835, the Mexican government sent the army under President Santa Anna to establish control. Texans, primarily American Texans, but also some Tejanos, or Mexican Texans, launched an independence movement on the 2nd of March, 1836. Over the next decade, intermittent fighting between the Mexican and Texan government continued as the Mexican Congress refused to accept the Texans' independence. The Texans also petitioned the United States to annex the territory. However, then President Andrew Jackson and his successor Martin Van Buren both viewed annexation as a political liability, given the strong anti-annexation faction in the United States at the time. This all changed in 1844 when James Polk won the election on a campaign centered on westward expansion and manifest destiny, a political philosophy which argued that Americans were destined to rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean because of the favor of Providence. Building on the work of his predecessor, John Tyler, Polk officially annexed Texas on the 29th of December 1845. This decision immediately spurred tensions with the Mexican government, who viewed the annexation as an unscrupulous land grab by the Americans. Polk sent representatives to try and negotiate for a land sale of much of northern Mexico. However, the Mexican government refused Polk's offers. Polk instead sent an American army under General Zachary Taylor to Texas. As Taylor's army moved towards Texas, Longstreet was reassigned after his promotion to the rank of second lieutenant on the 4th of March, 1846, to the 8th Infantry in St. Augustine, Florida. After arriving in August to be with his new unit, he and the unit were sent to Texas to be stationed at Corpus Christi, a small trading post located at the juncture of the Nueces River and the Gulf of Mexico, with the rest of Taylor's army of some 3,500 men. Longstreet, when not on duty, passed the time playing poker, hunting with fellow officers, and by helping with the local theatre that the officers had created to entertain the men. This all changed when in March of 1846 the American army began marching beyond the Nueces River towards the Rio Grande. The land between the two rivers was roughly 150 miles wide and extended for hundreds of miles into the interior. This land was claimed by both Mexico and the United States, though both had avoided confrontation over it. However, the United States was becoming increasingly belligerent. Longstreet and his men were more than happy to oblige. Arriving at the river only a few weeks later, the Americans quickly built a fort they dubbed Fort Texas. Longstreet and the rest of the men braced for conflict as skirmishes between Mexican troops under the command of General Mariano Arista and American forces increased with regularity. On the 1st of May, Taylor marched with part of his army to search for supplies. A siege was quickly raised against Fort Texas by the Mexican army, and it remained under siege until the 8th of May 1846, when Taylor's army returned. In a series of 2 battles, known as the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, the American army decisively defeated the larger Mexican force. These were James Longstreet's first battles, and though he later said little of the conflicts, these events were to dramatically shape the rest of Longstreet's life. These events, combined with an ambush on an American cavalry unit by Mexican forces, gave the president, James Polk, the sufficient evidence needed to convince the United States Congress to declare war. Polk, who had been looking for excuses to declare war, mobilized the American war machine, then a rather small force, supplemented by large numbers of volunteers. Soon thousands of men across the United States were rushing to enlist in the conflict. While many joined as soldiers, others protested the war as a land grab and against the principles of the United States. Many in Congress believed that these actions to gain Texas and provoke war with Mexico were being conducted in order to aid slave-owning states by providing more land for slavery's expansion. However, Longstreet had bigger concerns than what the state of politics were as he marched towards the northern Mexican city of Monterrey. On the 19th of September, the American army arrived at Monterrey, a city that had been fortified to become a difficult target for the Americans. Undeterred by the heavily fortified nature of the city, American troops began advancing on the 21st of September. Longstreet's infantry advanced behind a mounted unit from Texas. As the bullets began flying, the Texas troops broke and ran. However, Longstreet and his men counterattacked and began to push back the Mexican forces. Next, they were assigned to take Fort Libertad on a nearby hill. Succeeding in his task, Longstreet and his men were soon part of the hand-to-hand combat in the streets of Monterrey on the 23rd of September. However, on the 26th of September, the Mexican army retreated, leaving the city in American hands. Longstreet had performed well in the eyes of his superiors and demonstrated his natural ability as a leader, and was thus promoted by his commanders to the rank of first lieutenant. James's 8th Infantry was soon ordered to join a separate invasion force led by General Winfield Scott, who was planning to attack the Mexican port city of Veracruz and march on Mexico City. Longstreet and his men participated in the amphibious landing on the beaches of Veracruz, and soon after, the surrender of the Mexican forces in Veracruz on the 29th of March 1847, they were marching with the rest of the army towards Mexico City. The army ran smack into the forces of Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had been until recently in exile in Cuba. Santa Anna, the former president of Mexico, who had attacked Texan forces at the Alamo, returned to lead the army and was once again elected president of the Mexican Republic. Using a route discovered by Captain Robert E. Lee, Scott's forces were able to flank the Mexican forces and defeat them at the Battle of Cerro Gordo. During the battle, Longstreet and his men were held in reserve and watched as their fellow countrymen pushed back Mexican forces. His chance for battle soon came on the outskirts of Mexico City, when Longstreet helped lead his men to success in a battle near Churubusco. During the battle, Longstreet carried the regimental flag and was at the front of the charge on well-defended Mexican fortifications. For his bravery, Longstreet was promoted to be a captain. The young man from Georgia was quickly proving his value to his superiors. James was far from finished. Several weeks later, on the 8th of September 1847, Longstreet's 8th Infantry were driven back with heavy casualties attacking, but during the battle he served so valiantly that he was promoted to be brevet major. For one of the worst students at the military academy to have climbed so high so fast would perhaps have astounded his teachers. While Longstreet was not much for school or exam rooms, he held traits that led to success on the battlefield. A quick wit, bravery, and good sense helped Longstreet on more than one occasion. These skills were once again shown at the Battle of Chapultepec on the 13th of September, when he led his troops forward as the American assault was stalling. However, he took a musket ball to the leg and collapsed. The resulting injury proved to be tedious, and he stayed in the home of the Escandon family, an elite Mexican family who cared for American soldiers. After a 2-month stay in Mexico recovering, Longstreet returned back to the United States and went to visit his mother in Alabama. Throughout the war, Longstreet had carried a daguerreotype, or early type of photograph, of Louise. Still dedicated to her, the family now agreed the two could wed. On the 8th of March, 1848, James Longstreet was married to Louise Garland by William Kinkle, an Episcopalian minister. The couple made their way north to Poughkeepsie, New York, located a little over 80 miles north of New York City on the Hudson River, so James could serve as an army recruiter. Later that year, he transferred to Carlisle Barracks, located roughly 28 miles north of the small college town of Gettysburg. There, James's first son, John, was born on the 26th of December 1848. He and Louise would have 10 children over the course of their marriage. Soon, the family was back en route to Texas, where Longstreet was assigned to be with his old unit, the 8th Infantry, in May of 1849. The 8th was stationed in San Antonio, the famous site of the Alamo Mission, an old Catholic mission where Texas troops had been besieged during the War for Texan independence. The Longstreets were soon joined by Louise's family due to her father becoming commander of the 8th Infantry. The Garlands arrived in December of 1849 to much fanfare by the local inhabitants. The 8th was primarily responsible for fighting Native American raiding parties from the Great Plains. Longstreet was promoted to act as the commissary, a position that required attentiveness to detail in order to maximize the use of supplies for the military. He transferred back to the 8th in March of 1851 and began leading scouting parties throughout Texas. Though he had been promoted to major during the war, his promotion was only valid during the conflict, and he had returned to the rank of lieutenant at the war's end. In early December 1852, Longstreet was promoted to the rank of captain. This occurred only 4 months before Louise gave birth to their third child, William Longstreet. However, tragedy soon struck when, on a trip to Washington, D.C., little William, now a year old, died on the 19th of July 1854. Both the parents were devastated at the loss of their son and buried him in the Oak Hill Cemetery in Washington, D.C., before returning to Texas. In Texas, Longstreet now lived in Fort Bliss, close to the city of El Paso, in West Texas. He spent much of his time leading his men of Company K against the local Apache tribe, who had continued to raid settlements and farms. On one occasion in January of 1855, Longstreet helped lead a strike force into the Apache territory in the Guadalupe Mountains. This raid proved to be a failure and only resulted in 16 days of harsh cold and ice storms. Over the next few years, Longstreet increased his responsibilities when he would act temporarily as commander of the fort when the commanding officer was traveling. He finally became official commander in the spring of 1858. While there, the couple enjoyed themselves building lifelong connections through social events with the soldiers and Mexican residents of El Paso. Despite the comforts of his position and the good company of the fort, Longstreet worried about his children and their education. While traveling in 1858, he learned that he had been given a promotion to the rank of major and assigned as a paymaster in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Longstreet, who had just placed his son Garland in a school in Yonkers, New York, immediately set out for his post, which he remained at for 1 year until he was transferred to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be under the command of his father-in-law. Yet, as the transfer occurred in the fall of 1859, it happened at a time in which the United States seemed to be sliding quickly towards disaster. All of James's life, he had watched as tensions continued to boil between the free North and slaveholding South, though it had seemed that enough Americans were willing to compromise to forestall any armed conflict. However, it was the rise of the Republican Party, a new party formed in 1854 as an anti-slavery coalition, and the push of Southern slaveholders to expand and ensure their dominance in government policy that had pushed the nation to the brink of war. Conflicts in Kansas and other border states became increasingly violent. When John Brown, a Northern abolitionist, attempted to launch a slave revolt in Virginia in October of 1859, the divides between North and South seemed irretractable. When Abraham Lincoln was elected as president on a purely Northern vote in November of 1860, the tensions burst into open rebellion and sedition as South Carolina and the other Southern states began leaving the United States to become a new nation in December of 1860, the Confederate States of America. Longstreet, who learned the news weeks later, quickly sided with the Confederacy and began making plans to join the Confederate armies. He and others knew that the rupture was over slavery and its future in the new United States. Longstreet began in December of 1860 to correspond with the Confederate leadership, requesting a position in their army. He received a position as a lieutenant colonel on the 1st of May, 8 days before he resigned his commission in the United States Army. While still holding his position as major in the United States Army, Longstreet had joined the rebellion and had broken his oath to serve as a defender of the United States. In May of 1861, after waiting for his wife, who had just given birth to another daughter, Mary Ann, in December of 1860, to recover, he resigned his commission with the United States Army. Longstreet had finished up some last assignments and then began the trek to the east. Using the United States Army ambulance to convey his family, he continued to use U.S. supplies while acting as a Confederate officer. They arrived in El Paso, now part of the Confederacy, where Longstreet situated his family with friends in the city. He then quickly continued on towards Richmond, Virginia, via boat and the railroad. He arrived in the city, now the capital of the Confederate States of America, on the 21st of June, 1861. He met with the new Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, and learned that he had been promoted to be a brigadier general, a request he accepted officially on the 25th of June. Longstreet soon reported to Manassas Junction on the 2nd of July, where he was assigned to work under P.G.T. Beauregard, a former U.S. soldier who had fought well in the Mexican-American War. However, Beauregard gained his greatest fame by leading the attack on the U.S.-held Fort Sumter in South Carolina on the 12th of April, 1861. Beauregard was well beloved by his men and seen as a hero by many Southerners as one of the new Confederacy's first heroes. Longstreet soon had command of a brigade of Virginia regiments. Longstreet and his men skirmished with Union troops on the 18th of July, and on the 21st of July they held the center of the battle line, but did not experience as much action as other areas. Still, he and his men were accorded part of the victory in the first battle of Bull Run. In the aftermath of the battle, disease swept the Confederate camps and Longstreet became sick. For over a week he remained bedridden, but unlike the hundreds of other Confederates who were killed by disease, Longstreet survived. During the long months of waiting, Longstreet and his men served as front-line defenders near Fairfax Courthouse in Northern Virginia. Longstreet gathered around him a competent staff that he felt would be reliable in a battle and became close friends with fellow generals, which resulted in his promotion to Major General in October of 1861. As the Confederate Army settled into winter quarters near Centerville, Virginia, a small town located 25 miles from the Union capital of Washington, D.C., Longstreet and his fellow officers socialized and drank heartily. He had numerous friends from his time in the Mexican-American War and from his duties on the frontier. He and fellow officers reminisced and enjoyed themselves as they waited the next campaign season. However, for those officers on his staff, they learned that the old soldier could at times be grim and non-sociable if things did not go as ordered. Longstreet also stood by fellow generals Joseph Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard when they began to feud with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis over the direction of the Confederate armies. It was in January of 1862 when tragedy struck the Longstreet family. Louise and their children had moved to Richmond, Virginia. However, scarlet fever, a bacterial fever that generally infects children and younger teenagers, was sweeping through the city. The entire Longstreet family had caught the disease, and James rushed to the capital city to be with his family. He arrived in time to be present at the death of his daughter, Mary Ann, who died on the 25th of January, 1862. On the very next day, his son, James Jr., died. On the 1st of February, Louise and James watched as their 6-year-old son Augustus also died. The Longstreets were heartbroken at the loss of 3 more of their children. Several days later, James returned to his post in Centreville, though his grief was readily apparent to his men and fellow officers. A scare with his eldest son Garland nearly dying from the dreaded disease pushed Longstreet closer to religion and led him to give up his lifelong hobby of gambling. As the winter months marched on and tragedy faded, the Confederate Army prepared for the Union advance. The head general of the Confederate armies, Joseph Johnston, withdrew his forces from Centreville at the end of February due to the poor defensive position. Longstreet and his men quickly obeyed orders and moved towards the Rappahannock River further to the south. However, the Union Army surprised the Confederacy by moving tens of thousands of troops via water to a location near the colonial city of Jamestown, located only 100 miles south of Richmond. However, led by the slow-moving and cautious George McClellan, the Union forces advanced slowly, giving the Confederate Army time to move to defend their capital. Longstreet and his men were soon moving from the Rappahannock towards Richmond. During the early part of the Union advance towards Richmond, as Confederate forces retreated from their positions, Longstreet and his men stopped in the town of Williamsburg, Virginia, home of the College of William and Mary. There, he and his men helped delay the United States Army, though at a severe cost of life at over 1,500 dead in Longstreet's forces. James Longstreet came out of the battle a hero, praised for his decisiveness and ability to hold back the Federal assault. However, as he had already learned, the war was far from over. In the next 2-day battle between the 31st of May and the 1st of June at Seven Pines, Virginia, Longstreet made costly decisions, such as moving himself and many of his men to the rear of the fighting, thus causing challenges for the rest of the Confederate Army. The battle itself cost over 11,000 men on both sides and gained nothing for the Confederates. Subsequent chronologies of the war laid blame for the failure on Longstreet, in part due to his indecisiveness. However, one result of the battle was the appointment of Robert E. Lee as commander of the Confederate forces that were massed around Richmond, Virginia. Robert E. Lee, a Virginian in his mid-50s, had been a career soldier and was a distinguished officer in the Mexican-American War. Lee had served as Jefferson Davis's military advisor since March of 1862 and had become a trusted advisor to the Confederate government. Appointed to take command of what was soon to be called the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee had to work to gain trust among men like Longstreet who hardly knew him. Longstreet soon gained some confidence after their first few meetings. Lee was also impressed with Longstreet, calling him a capital soldier. In the coming weeks, Longstreet and Lee worked together as they prepared to launch an offensive against the Union forces massing south of Richmond. Over the next 2 months, a series of battles slowly drove the Union Army back towards Chesapeake Bay, through which Longstreet gained greater credibility as a capable and good commander. His courage in the 7 Days Campaign, a series of battles that occurred as the United States Army retreated from Richmond, Virginia, led Lee to begin to place greater trust in Longstreet and give him greater responsibility in the army. In August of 1862, Longstreet and his men travelled north towards Fredericksburg, Virginia, to aid in the repulsion of another incoming Federal army marching from the north towards Richmond. A series of small engagements occurred in late August as both armies sought to outmaneuver the other and gain the tactical advantage. These movements eventually resulted in the Battle of Second Manassas on the 29th and 30th of August, which for over a century was used as evidence by historians of Longstreet's failings as a commander. However, as noted by historian Geoffrey Wirt, Longstreet's actions likely prevented disaster for the Confederate Army, as he did not attack a position that was far more fortified than his commanding officer, Robert E. Lee, imagined. On the second day of the battle, the Confederate forces routed the Union troops and began their invasion of the border state of Maryland. Longstreet fully supported the invasion, though he disagreed with some of the specifics of Lee's plans, such as his plan to attack Harper's Ferry, a small Union garrison that could potentially harass the Confederate Army's supply lines. This invasion force was soon met by the Union armies near Sharpsburg, Maryland, in a battle that would be immortalized as the Battle of Antietam that occurred on the 17th of September 1862. During the battle, Longstreet was cool and composed, unrattled by the volume of fire emanating from Union lines. The battle was the worst of the war, and several times the Confederate lines broke, and Longstreet was said to have helped restore order during such moments. Over 24,000 men lost their lives in battle, and thousands more were wounded, maimed, or sickened. It has remained the bloodiest single day of conflict in American history. The surrounding countryside was completely devastated, leaving nothing but destruction in the wake of the two armies. Once fertile fields now appeared to be straight from a nightmare. Both sides claimed the battle to be a victory, and on the 22nd of September, the meaning of the Civil War began to change. Previously, the North had avoided making the war about slavery, many justifying their enlistment by devotion to country. However, many others also enlisted in the hope of beating back slavery. Southern leadership had always emphasized protecting slavery as one of the key reasons for the war. Leaders had declared that it was to be a foundational part of the Confederacy. But on the 22nd of September, with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the Union declared slavery void for those states in rebellion. Though not attacking slavery for those still loyal to the Union, the floodgates had been opened to transforming the Civil War into a war not just about the unity of a nation, but also about the freedom of millions of enslaved people in the United States. Longstreet and other Confederate generals were more than aware that this step would mean there would be no peaceful reunion. Though some viewed this as a temporary measure to win the war, many saw this as a new dawn of freedom. Following Antietam, the Confederate Army drew back to Virginia to regroup and prepare for spring. Longstreet was appointed on the 9th of October as a lieutenant general, one of the highest officers in the Confederate Army, at the recommendation of General Lee, and was given command of the 1st Corps, which consisted of 5 divisions, or approximately 41,000 troops. Longstreet had soldiers from 8 Confederate states under his command. His men were soon to be engaged in the heavy fighting around the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. The Union forces, led by newly appointed Commander Ambrose Burnside, sought to cross the Rappahannock River and seize the heights near the town. However, after several days of bloody fighting, the Federal troops were repulsed, having lost over 12,000 men to the Confederates' 5,000. The historic town had become a death trap for thousands of young men. Longstreet and other generals watched as thousands fell in gruesome slaughter. Yet, despite the horrors surrounding him, Longstreet once again displayed calmness, firmness, and savviness in the battle. The Confederates had succeeded in defeating a numerically superior army. While morale sagged in the north, jubilation flooded the south. Louise arrived soon after the battle to live with Longstreet in his winter quarters, allowing the couple to spend some time together before the next campaign season. In February 1863, Longstreet and his First Corps were detached to southern Virginia and North Carolina to counteract Federal operations in the area. While Robert E. Lee hoped to deliver a crushing blow, Longstreet favored a longer, but what he believed to be a more realistic approach of defeating small Union armies and then gathering for a major conflict with the United States Army of the Potomac. Longstreet remained in the area until in May, when he was ordered back to aid Lee's army as the Union was once again marching towards Richmond. He arrived to be present for a serious debate over how to approach the coming campaign season. Though he later distanced himself from Lee's decision to march north, at the time he was very supportive of an offensive to force the United States to concede the war. On the 3rd of June 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia began its march northwards, ready to awe and shock the people of Pennsylvania. Few could imagine what was soon to happen and how much it would devastate the Confederate war effort. By late June, Lee's army had arrived in Pennsylvania and seized the city of Chambersburg. The army was confident, sure of its ability to defeat Union forces and finally end the war by choosing a good spot to defeat the Union army. However, Union forces beat the Confederates to the punch, and a cavalry unit turned the Confederate army to the town of Gettysburg, a small backwater in central Pennsylvania. On the 1st of July 1863, Longstreet began moving his men quickly towards the town, and when seeing the town, the general was deeply concerned over the strength of position that the Union forces had chosen. He voiced his concerns to Lee, though the latter disregarded his advice, in part because of the impracticality of Longstreet's suggestion to perform a flanking maneuver in an unfamiliar area. The next day, as the Union and Confederate forces massed, Longstreet was assigned to the right flank and given the greatest charge of the battle to roll back the Union flank. Longstreet, smarting over Lee's unwillingness to listen, was less enthusiastic and, as a result, was less vigorous in his attack. Still, his men fought gallantly and pushed the Union lines back. However, he and his men paid dearly for their efforts, losing over 4,000 men that day. The battlefield would become famous, and the names of battle sites etched in history. Places such as the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top were places of terror and violence that Longstreet and his men would not soon forget. Longstreet, always sensitive to senseless loss of life, was deeply frustrated at Lee's reckless frontal assaults. On the 3rd of July, Lee once again asked for an assault on the entrenched Union position. Longstreet opposed this plan, particularly given the losses suffered by his men. Yet, once Lee issued the order, he agreed to follow. Assigned to conduct a frontal assault on the center of the Union lines, Longstreet and his men, along with units from other divisions. Longstreet did not believe the assault would succeed, and he was right. Though his men fought well, they were roundly defeated and driven back, losing entire divisions in the futile assault. The Confederate army withdrew and began the long march back to Virginia. The Battle of Gettysburg would haunt Longstreet for the rest of his life, as fellow Confederates lamented that had he been more decisive, then the war could have been won. Rather than blame Robert E. Lee, Confederate apologists blamed his right-hand man as the culprit for the South's failure at Gettysburg. For the rest of his life, Longstreet pointed the blame to Lee, stating he had obeyed his officer and that it was not his desire to engage in battle on such an undesirable field. Following the battle, Longstreet requested political friends in the Confederate Congress to transfer him to the West in order to no longer work under Lee. He was granted the request, and with 2 infantry divisions was sent to help the Confederate armies in Tennessee. Longstreet's men departed on the 9th of September, heading towards Chattanooga, Tennessee. He and his men saw their first action in Tennessee on the 20th of September at the Battle of Chickamauga, near Chattanooga. Longstreet was confident of success, but his commanding officer, General Braxton Bragg, declared the battle lost and refused to send more reinforcements. Still, Longstreet and his men succeeded in driving back the Union forces, and Longstreet was roundly praised for his efforts. While in Tennessee, Longstreet helped lead the movement to remove Braxton Bragg, his commanding officer, who he viewed as incompetent. Working behind the scenes, Longstreet worked to form a coalition of fellow lower-ranking generals that would unite against Bragg. However, instead, the Confederate President Jefferson Davis continued to support Bragg, undermining the entire operation. In retaliation for Longstreet's efforts to weaken him, Bragg reduced Longstreet's corps to a minimal amount. The conflicts among the generals bled over into the fighting, as the Confederate leadership was ill-prepared for its next battle at Chattanooga, where the Confederates laid siege to the Union Army in the city. Furthermore, Bragg had Longstreet and his corps moved to eastern Tennessee. While not a demotion, the object was likely to remove Longstreet from the heart of the action. Longstreet left on the 5th of November 1863, likely grateful to be far gone from Bragg. In eastern Tennessee, Longstreet went to work, quickly moving his men to attack the Union forces. Initially successful in driving back the United States troops, his forces were forced to stop by Fort Sanders, a fortress located on a small hill near East Knoxville, Tennessee. When Longstreet attempted to launch an assault on the fort on the night of the 29th of November 1863, the results were disastrous. Hundreds of Confederates died in minutes due to lack of planning on Longstreet's part and underestimating the resolve of the Union garrison. Following the failed assault, Longstreet was ordered to Georgia to return to be with the defeated and fleeing army of Braxton Bragg. On the night of the 4th of December 1863, Longstreet and his men began their retreat. The failure to take Knoxville led to widespread criticism of the once favored general, who in turn bristled with indignation. Furthermore, bold plans James had to conquer Kentucky in order to influence the 1864 United States election were shelved by Confederate leadership. Longstreet was well aware of the insecurity Lincoln faced in obtaining another 4 years in the White House. The slow pace of the war, the loss of life, and the drafts had all helped make Lincoln far less popular among many people. Furthermore, the status of the war, with Union armies bogged down and failing to gain victories, had deeply subdued morale across the North. Longstreet wanted to help push the U.S. electorate towards a peace candidate who would end the war with an intact Confederacy. However, his plans were dismissed as too unrealistic, and he was transferred back to Virginia. In Virginia, the Confederates now faced a new opposing general, Longstreet's old friend Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Vicksburg and other victories in the Western theater of the Civil War. At the first confrontation between the two friends, at the Battle of Wilderness in May of 1864, the Confederacy failed to drive the Union from the area. The battle was perhaps Longstreet's finest hour, as he successfully conducted his battle plan to perfection. However, during the battle, Longstreet got caught in friendly fire and took a bullet to his shoulder, which went through his neck. Though not killed, he was removed to the back of the conflict. His injury removed him from the front line, which in turn stalled the Confederate offensive, thus denying the Confederates the ability to drive the Union out of Virginia. Longstreet spent the next month resting and recovering before requesting leave to go home to Georgia. Longstreet left for Georgia in July with his wife and children, who had joined him following his injury. He spent the rest of the summer with his family at his estate. James continued to write to Lee, learning that the Union was grinding down the Confederates and slowly moving closer and closer to Richmond. In September, Longstreet headed back to Richmond, arriving in the capital on the 25th of September. Though still crippled in his arm where the bullet had entered, Lee and others wanted Longstreet's mind to help stop the Union war machine, which had been reinvigorated by Abraham Lincoln's re-election and William T. Sherman's victory in Atlanta. Sherman, a subordinate of General Grant, had launched a scorched earth campaign by destroying the infrastructure throughout Georgia in his famous March to the Sea. This campaign disheartened the Confederacy and also badly ruined supply lines. The Confederate Army was reeling, and on the 2nd of April began the retreat from Richmond. After a series of small engagements and the collapse of the Confederate Army, on the 9th of April, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. On the 12th of April, Longstreet took leave of the army to return to Georgia, leaving behind his career to pursue peace. Though he was no longer a soldier, The scars of war remained with him the rest of his life, driving him to try to avoid war at all costs. Following the war, Longstreet and his family moved to New Orleans, a prosperous city that had survived the fiery inferno of the previous 2 years of war due to it having been conquered in 1862 by Union forces. Longstreet joined a cotton brokerage led by 2 former Confederate officers in an effort to expand his material wealth. When he traveled to Washington, D.C. to apply for a pardon, the new president, Andrew Johnson, a Kentucky Unionist who had been Abraham Lincoln's vice president during his second term, denied his request. After Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth in 1865, Johnson took charge of the United States and its efforts to reconstruct the defeated South. Johnson explained that to pardon Longstreet was impossible because Longstreet had caused the North far too much trouble during the war. As a result, James Longstreet remained a man with no political rights and no pardon. Still, he sought to rebuild his life and returned with Louise and his children to New Orleans. Longstreet began to travel extensively for his work, looking to secure cotton crops for the firm. He also dabbled in railroads and insurance, focusing his efforts fully on establishing a new life. Longstreet watched as the radical Republican faction rose to prominence in Congress. The radical Republicans had been the most anti-slavery and most pro-war faction during the war. Focusing on radically altering the makeup of the South, many radical Republicans sought to provide political rights to the formerly enslaved African Americans. Many former Confederates resisted, but Longstreet reminded those around him publicly to pursue moderation and acknowledge that they were a conquered people. In New Orleans, the Republican Party courted Longstreet, and he felt it was better to cooperate than resist. Longstreet refused to rise in further rebellion and instead believed that Southern whites could still control politics through manipulating African American politics. Despite warnings from family and friends, Longstreet urged in a public letter on the 8th of June 1866 for Southern whites to work with Republicans in order to control the black American vote. While white Southerners condemned Longstreet and Northerners praised him, Southern black Americans condemned Longstreet's racist view of controlling African American politics. In August 1866, Longstreet fled New Orleans with his family following the backlash from the letter. Over the next 2 years, Longstreet periodically returned, though he spent much of his time in the North and Virginia. During this period, he endorsed Ulysses S. Grant's presidential run, further inflaming hatred against him in the South. Grant subsequently gave Longstreet a job as surveyor of customs in New Orleans. Having received a pardon in June 1868, Longstreet was free to take the position. However, for many Southerners, Longstreet had betrayed the cause and was a traitor. As the lost cause myth grew in the South, which argued that the Civil War had been about states' rights and that the Confederate armies were only defeated by greater Northern manpower rather than by the righteousness of the cause of the North, Longstreet became one of the narrative's villains, a man whose failures as a commander had cost the Confederacy the victory. Longstreet, well aware that he was the scapegoat, was shocked that his fellow Southerners so quickly turned on him. In his mind, the blood and carnage of war was not worth resistance to the North. By the 1870s, Longstreet had become fully involved in the Louisiana Republican Party and had been appointed as a major general of the state militia, which included both black and white troops. By 1872, Longstreet was known as a radical Republican, an identity that won him few allies in the South. After assuming command of the New Orleans Metropolitan Police Force, a largely black force, he successfully put down Louisiana Democrat efforts to overturn the election in favor of their candidate through armed resistance. The conflict, however, continued to escalate as the New Orleans White League, a white supremacist group, continued to fight against the Republican government. In September of 1874, tensions boiled over into armed conflict. Longstreet attempted to put down an armed insurrection in New Orleans, but was hit and taken prisoner. This event led to further denunciation of Longstreet by fellow white Southerners who viewed Longstreet ultimately as a traitor. Shortly after the conflict, Longstreet was relieved as commander of the force and left behind New Orleans politics. In the summer of 1875, Longstreet and his family left behind New Orleans and returned to Georgia, settling near Gainesville. Throughout 1876 and 1877, Longstreet continued to work his business connections and also involve himself in national politics. In March of 1877, he converted to the Roman Catholic faith, thus further enraging white Protestant Southerners. His conversion was deep and sincere as he sought a closer connection with God. The man who had once been a hero of the South had become one of its worst enemies. Still, his loyalty to the Republican government led to his promotion as an official United States minister to the Ottoman Empire in May of 1880. However, Longstreet was ill-qualified and only did a little while in the post. After a tour of Europe in 1881, Longstreet was recalled to the United States and took the position as U.S. Marshal for Georgia. His years as a marshal were marred with controversy as some of the members of his staff were found to be involved in corruption schemes. Though declared innocent by investigators, they recommended that Longstreet be relieved due to incompetence. In 1884, seen as a liability to the Republican Party, Longstreet was asked to resign and return to his farm, a passion he had developed since the war. However, a devastating fire in 1889 destroyed his farm and much of his war mementos. This tragedy was followed by a much more devastating loss, that of his wife Louise, in December of 1889. Longstreet, devastated by the loss, focused on writing his memoirs. Working without his years of notes that had been lost in the fire, Longstreet began again and focused on casting himself as a tragic hero in the Civil War. For decades, Longstreet had been attacked by former Confederate officers for causing the loss at Gettysburg, an accusation which Longstreet vehemently contested. After years of work, in the spring of 1896, Longstreet published his memoirs, which were immediately received with both love and hatred. Longstreet, long used to the criticism, decried his detractors and continued to seek to establish a better life. One way he did so was through his marriage to Helen Dortch in Atlanta in September of 1897. The marriage shocked his children, particularly that she was over 40 years his junior. Though Longstreet's children never cared for the new bride, Helen was a loyal defender of James Longstreet even after his death. She gladly married the old general and brought a spark of light to his life. The couple soon moved to Washington, D.C., where Longstreet assumed the post of United States Commissioner of Railroads, a prestigious position that came as a result of his efforts to help Republican William McKinley in his election. However, Longstreet's health began to fail, and on the morning of the 2nd of January 1904, Longstreet died due to complications from pneumonia. His funeral was held 4 days later and was widely attended. The hero and villain of the South now lay in final peace in the Gainesville Cemetery. Over the next several decades, Longstreet continued to be framed as the cause of the South's failure in the Civil War, particularly his role at the Battle of Gettysburg. Historians who relied upon narratives of the lost cause were quick to condemn the general. However, recent histories have since taken a more balanced view of the general. Some popular works, such as The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. This book, a Pulitzer Prize winner, cast Longstreet in a much more sympathetic light. Debates still rage as to how the man should be viewed, particularly given his efforts to defend slavery. James Longstreet was a brilliant military tactician, a career soldier, a businessman, a planter, a slaveholder, a Republican, a foreign minister, a writer, and was seen by many as a traitor. He grew up in Georgia, rose to prominence during the Mexican-American War, helped lead Confederate armies as Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, served in Republican governments, led a black police force against anti-abolitionists, converted to Roman Catholicism, and spent his life fighting to preserve his legacy as one of honor and valor rather than one as a traitor. What do you think of James Longstreet? Was he a brilliant general, or was he a traitor to his country? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.